Ceuta has triggered a new EU border push, and Brussels is listening. The EU letter that could mark a new era for Europe's external borders. Ceuta has done something that years of European migration arguments failed to do. It has turned border protection from a national problem into an immediate test of whether the European Union is actually prepared to defend its external frontier together. The extraordinary letter signed by 22 EU member states, followed by Ursula von der Leyen's new warning that more must be done to strengthen Europe's borders, suggests the political response is moving beyond Ceuta itself. The question now is whether this becomes a temporary reaction to one extraordinary crisis or the beginning of a much harder European border policy. The letter changes the political temperature. The immediate trigger was extraordinary. Between Wednesday and Friday last week, an estimated 50,000 to 60,000 people entered Ceuta from Morocco, a territory whose population is only around 84,000. Many crossed through the sea around the border infrastructure, while others reached the territory by land. Reception facilities were overwhelmed, and dozens of people died. By Monday, Spain said around 69,500 people had returned to Morocco, although thousands were still believed to be in Ceuta. The sheer scale made the incident impossible for Brussels to treat as another Mediterranean migration episode. On the 1st of August, 22% of the EU's 27 member states called for an emergency meeting of interior ministers and demanded a coordinated European response. The letter warned that uncontrolled mass crossings, the instrumentalization of migration, and other potential hybrid threats could create the perception that illegal entry into the EU was possible and could ultimately result in legal stay. That language matters. It is not simply a request for Spain to receive more money or additional personnel. It is an argument that the security of an external EU border is a collective European responsibility, and that a failure at one point can alter behavior across the entire bloc. The signatories also raised the possibility of reinforcing or reintroducing temporary internal border controls. That is potentially much more consequential. Schengen was designed to remove routine internal border checks precisely because member states trusted one another to protect the external frontier. When countries begin discussing internal controls because they believe the external frontier is under pressure, the problem is no longer confined to the border itself. It becomes a question of confidence in the entire system. And then, von der Leyen went further. The most important development came on the 3rd of August. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen told Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez that more needed to be done to strengthen EU borders at critical points. In a letter seen by Reuters, von der Leyen proposed closer cooperation with Spain on Ceuta and Melilla, including stronger border management early warning systems and improved technical and financial support for Morocco. That is the part of the story that deserves attention. The EU is not merely talking about putting more officers on a fence after a crisis. It is talking about detecting the conditions for another crisis earlier. That means intelligence. It means monitoring. It means closer coordination between Spain, Brussels, and Morocco. And it means trying to prevent a sudden movement of tens of thousands of people from becoming an emergency before European authorities can react. The distinction is important because the traditional European response to migration has often been reactive. People arrive. Reception systems become overloaded. Governments argue about responsibility. And only then does Brussels mobilize. Ceuta has exposed the weakness of that model. Europe already has a new migration system. There is another reason this moment matters. The EU's new Pact on Migration and Asylum entered into application on June 12, 2026. After a 2-year implementation period. It establishes common procedures for screening and registering irregular arrivals, faster asylum and return procedures, clearer rules over responsibility, and a solidarity mechanism intended to support countries experiencing migratory pressure. In theory, this is exactly the kind of framework that should prevent an individual border crisis from becoming an EU-wide political crisis. But Ceuta arrived almost immediately as a brutal stress test. The crisis raises a simple question. What happens when the numbers become so large and so sudden that the national system at the external border is overwhelmed before the European machinery can properly respond? That is the gap the new political push is trying to close. The EU does not necessarily need an entirely new migration system. It may need to make the existing one faster, more integrated, and much more heavily focused on preventing uncontrolled entry in the first place. Morocco is becoming even more important. There is another uncomfortable reality behind the letter. Europe cannot physically move its external border to Morocco, but it can make the Moroccan side of that border much more important. The EU has spent years building cooperation with Morocco around migration and border management. The Council describes the Western Mediterranean route as including both arrivals into mainland Spain and crossings into Ceuta and Melilla, while explicitly highlighting cooperation with Morocco on border management, institutional capacity, and migration. Von der Leyen's latest letter points in the same direction. More technical support, more financial support, better early warning, closer coordination. That effectively means Europe wants Morocco to remain part of the security architecture protecting Europe's southern frontier. There is a practical reason for this. Morocco controls the other side of the physical border. Spain can build barriers in Ceuta, deploy police and soldiers, patrol the surrounding waters, and manage reception centers. But if tens of thousands of people are able to gather on the Moroccan side and move towards the border simultaneously, Spain is already responding to a crisis that has begun. Stopping the crisis earlier is therefore far more attractive than trying to contain it after it reaches Spanish territory. But it also creates dependency. The more Europe relies on a neighboring state to control migration before it reaches EU territory, the greater the leverage that neighboring state possesses. That is not a theoretical problem. Ceuta has already demonstrated how politically explosive the relationship between Spain and Morocco can become. The biggest misunderstanding about Ceuta. There is one important fact that has been largely buried beneath the political reaction. The mass crossing did not result in tens of thousands of people freely moving into mainland Spain or the rest of Europe. EU officials stressed that no one reached mainland Spain or another EU member state during the influx. Ceuta is subject to special Schengen arrangements, with checks applying to people traveling from the enclave towards mainland Spain or other Schengen countries. That weakens the argument that the immediate crisis was equivalent to tens of thousands of migrants suddenly gaining unrestricted access to the entire Schengen area. It does not, however, make the border breach irrelevant. The political concern is about precedent. If a mass crossing can occur at an external EU border, European governments fear that future migrants, or potentially states and criminal networks attempting to exploit migration pressure, may conclude that overwhelming one border is an effective strategy. That is the logic behind the 22-state letter. The concern is less 60,000 people are now traveling around Europe, and more, what happens if Europe allows the next 60,000 to person breach to become easier? That is a much stronger argument for tightening the external frontier. The Frontex question is coming back. The crisis is also reopening an old European argument. How much authority should the EU itself have over national borders? Manfred Weber, leader of the European People's Party, has already argued that Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, should have real enforcement powers, including command authority in circumstances where a national government is judged unwilling or unable to secure the external border. That is a major political step. The European project has traditionally relied on national governments retaining primary responsibility for their own borders, while EU agencies provide coordination, funding, and operational assistance. Giving Frontex stronger command powers would move the EU closer to a genuinely European border force. That would be controversial. Supporters would argue that Europe's external borders are already a collective responsibility because the removal of internal borders makes them collectively important. Opponents would argue that handing command authority to Brussels would transfer one of the most fundamental powers of the nation-state, control over who enters its territory, to an EU institution. Ceuta, therefore, touches something much larger than migration. It touches sovereignty. Spain is angry, and there is a reason. Madrid has also reacted furiously to the European response. Sanchez has accused some EU governments of responding asymmetrically, particularly after Italy moved to reintroduce targeted checks on non-EU travelers arriving from Spain, and France increased policing at its border with Spain. From Spain's perspective, the sequence is difficult to swallow. A mass crossing happens at Spain's external border. Spain deploys security forces. Thousands return to Morocco. Spain asks for European solidarity, and some European governments respond by tightening their own borders with Spain. The political message from Madrid is straightforward. If Europe considers Spain's border to be Europe's border, Europe should help defend it rather than punish Spain for being the country where the crisis happened. That argument has considerable force, but the opposing view is equally clear. Other governments fear that Spain's migration policies may be creating incentives that affect the rest of Europe. The 22-to-state letter explicitly raised Spain's regularization plans as a possible pull factor, although Madrid disputes that interpretation. This is therefore not simply Northern Europe versus Southern Europe. It is an argument about whether national migration policies can remain nationally determined when their consequences can spread across a borderless internal European market. Britain should be watching closely. For Britain, the significance is obvious. The UK is outside the EU and Schengen, but it faces its own migration and channel crossing pressures. Tailored's analysis of Britain's record small boat crossings has already highlighted the same underlying problem. Enforcement at one point can simply displace routes and behavior elsewhere. Britain's record migrant crossing crisis. That is exactly why the European response to Ceuta matters beyond Spain. If the EU develops stronger external border surveillance, faster returns, greater Frontex involvement, and more aggressive cooperation with transit countries, Britain will inevitably have to watch what works. It may also face a political choice. Does Britain cooperate more closely with European countries on intelligence and enforcement? Or does it continue trying to solve channel migration, largely through bilateral arrangements with France in its own domestic system? Ceuta strengthens the argument that migration routes are increasingly interconnected. A crackdown in one country can move pressure somewhere else. A legal ruling in one country can change behavior elsewhere. And a political decision about regularization can become an issue in neighboring states. The real test comes after the headlines. The Ceuta crisis is already fading as a physical emergency. But politically, it may have only just begun. Spain is installing new containment infrastructure at the Ceuta waterfront, including a 500-meter inflatable barrier and anchored buoys. The EU is preparing emergency talks. Member states have demanded coordinated action. Italy has restored targeted checks. France has strengthened its border presence. And now von der Leyen is calling for stronger EU border management, early warning systems, and deeper support for Morocco. That is a remarkable amount of movement in less than a week. The crucial question is, what happens next? If the emergency meeting produces little more than political statements, Ceuta will become another dramatic episode in Europe's long-running migration argument. If it produces stronger intelligence sharing, additional funding, a clearer role for Frontex, faster European response mechanisms, and a tougher external border strategy, then the crisis will have changed EU policy. That is the real significance of the letter. Ceuta did not suddenly create Europe's border problem. It exposed how quickly an external border problem can become a European political problem. And Brussels now appears to be responding by moving the border debate one step closer to the center of European power.